And where you didn't have that pronatal culture, you probably didn't survive as a society. Demography matters precisely insofar as people matter. All of this has an enormous impact on technology, on military force, on elections. Desire to have fewer children has gone really global. Jamaica and Thailand have lower fertility rates than Britain.
1 out of 6 children are in poverty in the world. How can you even tell people to have children?
Sometime between now and then, the wheels are going to come off.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I loved your book, The Human Tide, and in it you talk about the role demography played in human societies and the way it's shaped history. Before we go into the specifics of demography, fertility rates, why does demography even matter to us?
It seems so obvious to me why it matters that it almost is difficult for me to say. I mean, demography matters precisely insofar as people matter. If we had a world in which people didn't matter, for history, for society, for economics, for politics, then demography wouldn't matter. But as long as people actually are of some consequence, then who gets born, who doesn't get born, how old a society is, what the average age is, how many kids people have, where people migrate from, where they migrate to, all of this has an enormous impact on power, on military force, on elections, on enterprise. I mean, people tend to be more entrepreneurial when they're younger, on creativity, on innovation, on technology. It's very hard to understand modern society if you think about a modern country, if you think about, say, Japan versus Chad, or you think of India versus Britain. What's the size of the population? How old is the average person? How many kids are they having? Unless you can understand all of that, I think you can't start to think about its politics, its economics, and that also applies to the past. I don't think you can understand the history of anything, really, if you don't understand what was the population at the time. Was it growing? Was it shrinking? Was it old? Was it young? Were people having lots of kids? So just to give you some examples from history, I mean, in my book, The Human Tide, I don't think you can understand why was the US sweeping across the continent of America? They had a huge population boom. The reasons for that is another subject. The French, who held the whole of the center of what is now notionally the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, in the first decade of the 19th century, they couldn't hold it. They had 1% of the number of people that the Americans had. So you can't understand the expansion of the US. You can't understand why countries went to war in 1914 or what the consequences of the war were and who won, who could raise a larger army. I just think it's a lens. And once you start to look through that lens at history or at the contemporary world, you can't unsee it.
And how much of demography does it drive history and how much is it a result of it? So when we're looking at economic, politics, science, tech, how much of this was a result of this demographic drive we've had and how much of it was just an outcome of it?
There's nothing that is exogenous to the system. So human systems, physical systems are very complex, and it's very difficult to say this is the external force that somehow is in the hands of God or in the hands of some external, and it bears on the rest. So, of course, demography is a huge driver of history, but of course it's driven by history. So, for example, young populations are much more likely to develop new technologies. But on the other hand, you don't get a population boom unless you've got the kind of technologies that lower infant mortality, that provide people with more food. So the great boom of British population in the 19th century, both at home and producing a population to go overseas, was only possible because the Industrial Revolution and the huge ability of Britain to import food, whereas previously the Brits had been constrained by the food they could produce nationally. So it's obviously tied up with technology and economics and politics. It's not an exogenous factor, some deus ex machina from the outside. On the other hand, nothing is. So all the things we look at, the politics, the economics, the sociology, they're all intertwined. In order to understand how the world works and how it has worked, we tend to take a particular lens to think about what the causes on that lens were, and then, to mix my metaphors, and then what you can see freshly by looking through that lens. So I'm never making the case that demography is exogenous to the system, and in many ways, what's driving the demography is as interesting as what the demography is driving, at least for me.
Paul, so it's so easy to look at this in an abstract sense, talk about demography, young societies, old societies, but for most of human history, what did this mean for the average person? What does society look like, and what does that mean practically?
Well, for most of human history, which really means everywhere up to about 1800, It was the world that Malthus described.
Who was Malthus?
Thomas Robert Malthus was a British clergyman who was writing at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, and he described the system really as it was about to start changing and thought it was eternal. And the way he described it, he actually wrote, I think there were 6 editions of his book, and it changed very much from the first to the second. But in the first, he had the simplest theory, which was, look, whatever happens, the average couple might have, say, 6 kids, 7 kids. And that means every cohort would triple. 2 would become 6, and 6 would triple to 8, and so on and so on and so on. And that can't happen because you'd run out of food. Now, wars may intervene, disease may intervene, but if they don't, the population will simply bang up against its food capacity, and we'll all live in misery at the edge of what the world can produce. And if you could suddenly produce twice as much food, the population will quickly double, and then twice as many people will be at that frontier of misery. So the world was largely a world of, up to 1800, a world of very, very high fertility. So people had 6, 7, 8 children on average, and very, very low life expectancy. Lots of people being born, lots of people dying, and a small population. Now, of course, there's a much more interesting story in that. You have things like the Black Death. You have the long medieval period before the Black Death, when Europe was managing through new technologies to drain more land and had better harnesses on horses and so on. So that meant that the crops were larger. Crop yields were possible, more land came under the plough, and so the population grew and grew and grew in the Middle Ages, and then you had the Black Death. So there's lots of, there were famines in China, there were plagues in Rome, so it's a complicated history. But broadly, as Malthus said, populations tended to grow up towards the capacity of the food to sustain those populations. And you sometimes had control mechanisms like, Suti in India, which would kill off widows, or the monasteries and nunneries in Europe, which were supposed to take large numbers of people and take them out of the breeding pool effectively. Whether they did or didn't is another question. So there were social mechanisms for controlling the population below that level. But that was basically, I think, to put it really simply, high fertility, lots of kids being born, high mortality, which means people didn't live very long. Maybe a third of kids would die before their first or second birthday, and a small population. And then you go through the transition where, first of all, down comes the mortality rate. Because of technology, people live longer, still having large families, the population grows. And then as people get more urban and educated, down comes fertility. And so you go from high fertility, high mortality, small population, to low fertility, low mortality, high population. That's broadly what Britain did in the 19th century, and the rest of the world, first of all Europe, and now other countries followed. So that today, the entire world has either gone through that transition, is in a new phase, which we'll probably talk about, or it's going through it. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, if you might think it's poor and you might think it's underdeveloped, but look at the infant mortality rates. They're very high, but they're collapsing. Life expectancy is growing significantly, and in some places, fertility is coming down. So there's almost nowhere in the world. I think at the national level, there is no country that hasn't at least started to go through this process by seeing its mortality rate come down.
We seem to have swung from one fear to the other. You have Malthusian theories like overpopulation, and then more recent iteration of neo-Malthusian with Paul Ehrlich and his book, The Population Bomb. Are these guys just wrong, or are these guys products of their time? Well, to be fair, Paul Ehrlich's probably wrong, but Thomas Malthusian's theory, are these guys just products of their time, or even during their time they were wrong? Because it's quite biologically determinist to think that humans are just going to outbreed. There's cultural innovations that humans can come up with to control breeding, and so when looking a more objective lens at human history, was that always the case, that we just bred like rabbits and died, and it was that increased fertility rate that kept us going?
Well, Ehrlich's still alive. He's extremely old. Malthus is not alive, and he died in the 1830s, I think. I think Malthus described this system, this very simple system, and then in his subsequent writings he understood it was a bit more complicated than that, and particularly he got interested in the social, cultural, religious structures that would control fertility rates, and that he realized that not every society was breeding up to its limit, and actually then he preached people should constrain their fertility, and that basically men shouldn't marry until they could afford a family. And if that was the case, society would control itself. I think he was right as a describer of the past. I think two enormous things have happened since Malthus's day. The first is that our ability to create food has grown enormously, and with that, our ability to extend life, the medicine, and so on, so that we can actually live on average. Even quite poor countries like India, still relatively poor. I think people are living into their 70s on average, whereas they might have been living into their 50s 30, 40 years ago. So I think we have the means now for vast numbers of people throughout the world, the vast majority of humanity, to have much lower infant mortality, much longer lives. And then the second thing, so those constraints that Malthus talked about, that ceiling has been lifted. It wasn't all lifted in one go. Like at the end of the 19th century, people thought we were going to run out of food again, and then the Haber-Bosch process was created, which meant we could produce much more food. So I think we're now at a point, given how much our population growth is slowing, and given where our technology is, we'll always be able to feed. We can feed 10 million people without much difficulty, and we're only at 8. So that Malthusian constraint has gone on the one hand. He thought population would push and push and push against this ceiling. The ceiling's lifted, and the push has gone, because we've learned how to constrain our fertility. It's become very, very simple to do. It's become socially acceptable in most societies, and people want to use it for whatever reason. Again, we may come on to talk about that. So instead of a world in which we have this enormous demographic pressure pushing against resource constraints, we've got very little demographic pressure. Population growth every year is lower and lower and lower. More and more countries have fewer and fewer children, more and more use of contraception. And then the ceiling has been lifted largely. Now, back in the 60s, that wasn't, even in the 1960s, because what was happening, what I said was happening in Britain in the 19th century, that you got much better medicine, you got much better food, people didn't have fewer children, and so for a period, massive population growth, and eventually fertility rates came down. In the 60s, that's where a lot of the world was. That's where India was. That's where China was. 1970, people were still having 6 children in China. But all of these countries were seeing incredible improvements in their life expectancy and falls in their infant mortality. And so people like Ehrlich said, we're back in a Malthusian situation. We've got all this great technology. We've had the Haber-Bosch process. We've had the Green Revolution. That we can see a new ceiling, and people are still having lots of kids, and the population's growing. So he was perhaps right to be worried in the 60s, but what he got wrong, he then said, and I'm sure you know about his book, The Population Bomb, what he thought was that millions, billions are going to die of starvation. And the reason that hasn't happened is precisely, as I said, on the one hand, our ability to create food and generally to look after people, the technology of doing that has been transformed since the 60s when I was born. I mean, when I was born in Britain, for example, 20 to 25 babies per 1,000 died in their first year. Now it's like 4 or 5. I mean, 20 per 25 per 1,000 was incredibly good in the 60s. It was like cutting edge. And now in countries like Japan, it's 2. So our ability to look after people has improved. Calorific intake has improved. The number of the calories we produce per person globally is more than adequate. And then on the other hand, what I think nobody could have, well, very few people would have suspected in the 1960s was that this desire to have fewer children has gone really global. So it's interesting, if you go back to the early 20th century, France had really controlled their fertility for a long time, and they'd lost their power in Europe. They were no longer the largest nation as they'd been in the days of Louis XIV and Napoleon. They were very conscious of them. They looked over the Rhine and they said, oh, these Germans, they'll always be having big families. They'll always outbreed us. And then by 1914, the Germans were down to 3 children per woman. The Germans looked east and said, oh, the Russians, they're always going to be having big families. But just as they couldn't imagine, Germans in 1914 couldn't imagine that Russians would one day have 1 or 2 children per woman. So in the 1960s, Ehrlich couldn't imagine that Koreans and Indians and Chinese people would have what they have today, which is in the case of India about 2, in the case of China about 1, in the case of Korea about 2/3. So I think there's a kind of, from a European, because this all started with Malthus, the thinking about it, and the process started in Europe, it's kind of Eurocentric ethnocentric sense that we've adopted these low fertility rates, but those less urban, less educated, less wealthy people over there won't do so. It's hard to imagine they will. And actually, of course, they do. And so just as in the early 20th century, the French couldn't imagine the Germans would have a low fertility rate, and they got there very quickly. So in the 1960s, Ehrlich couldn't imagine that the Chinese government would end up begging its people to have children, or that India would be below replacement, or that South America would be lower than North America. I mean, today, for example, and the two examples I always give, just because they're sort of easy for people to get their heads around, Jamaica and Thailand have lower fertility rates than Britain. So the idea that it's any longer a rich country issue is over. And I think Ehrlich just couldn't imagine that. He couldn't imagine, on the one hand, the incredible ability of us as a human species to keep on coming up with brilliant ideas to grow new food. And on the other hand, he couldn't imagine that people in what he would have called the third world back in the 60s would end up wanting to have such small families.
There's this link between rich countries and demography and birth rates. And you point out in the book how the Industrial Revolution couldn't have happened if it wasn't for Britain or Western Europe's increased birth rate, increased demography. Could that ever be decoupled? And can you say that birth rates came before the Industrial Revolution and it allowed it to proliferate? Or could it be that Industrial Revolution allowed the birth rates to increase by providing more material resources, providing more food? Can that ever be decoupled, or is it just sort of too hard to distinguish?
There's a great debate, and it's probably, somewhat scholarly and detailed and not of that wide interest, but there's a very interesting debate among historians about what came first, the chicken or the egg. And one school of thought, looking at the Industrial Revolution, and one school of thought there is that we got some basic improvements. The population started to grow. People left, we got better technologies in the countryside. We didn't need all those hands. They flocked to the city. Something needed to be done with them. Opportunity of cheap labour, along comes industry. The other argument is, actually industry got going and it was a demand for labour and wages went up and people could keep their kids alive longer with better industrial wages. So one sees the technology as driving the demography and the other sees the demography as driving the technology. I don't think that kind of debate will ever ultimately be settled. But what I argue in The Human Tide is that you would simply not have got very far with one without the other. So if you'd had the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but it hadn't stimulated great population growth, you could never have had industry on the scale that you did. So Belgium was a very early industrializer, probably the first country to industrialize after Britain, or in some ways at the same time. Belgium never became the workshop of the world because it never had a large enough population. So Britain would have been a very wealthy country making some very good manufactures, cheap manufactures that would have shipped them out to the world. But it would never have been able to have the kind of impact it had. It wouldn't have been able to colonize so many countries. It wouldn't have been able to settle so many countries. And it wouldn't have been able to dominate the world economy because British factories would have been nice and they would have produced cloth that people could have afforded in certain countries, but it couldn't have swamped the world and transformed the world apparel industry as it did first of all. That was the first industrial revolution, without having the hands in the factories. At the same time, if Britain had had a population explosion, but it hadn't had industry, it hadn't had something to export, it hadn't had people to export, to go and live on the plains and actually develop with modern 19th century agriculture that huge food surplus, then that population would have just hit a Malthusian ceiling and evenharvest been knocked
like India.
back.
India had a massive population,
Yes.
but it didn't become an industrial
and
giant.
India, when it had a bad harvest, would have a famine. Britain never had a famine after, I can't remember. I mean, I think even the late 17th century. That's why the Irish famine of the 1840s is so exceptional, because it's such a shock that as late as 1840, you could have a famine in the British Isles. And there's a whole different subject. It's very interesting in Britain, our last famine in the British Isles was in the 1840s, and in Great Britain was even earlier. So you would simply not have been able to sustain a larger population without the Industrial Revolution. However much, of course, ultimately agriculture would have been able to produce extraordinary surpluses, but it would have taken a very long time. And again, Ireland's a very good case of that. You had this enormous population explosion from the 17th century to the 1840s with the potato, and the potato was perfect. The potato in Ireland could sustain a much bigger population than what had been grown in Ireland previously. It was quite a damp climate, it wasn't great for wheat, and the population grew and grew and grew, and then because there was no industry, there was no wealth to export industrial products and import agricultural products. There was a famine in Ireland when there was a potato rot. So my point really is just that whichever got going first is really difficult to say, and maybe it can't be said, but the two grew up together, and without the one, the other would have petered out.
Paul, so looking in the context of superpowers and rising powers, obviously the technology is very important, and that's sort of a necessity for that. But do you need like a growing, young, youthful population to actually become a superpower?
The technology is clearly very important. I think without a young population, you don't have the aggression or the expansionist urge. So I don't think you could take a country like Japan today, median age rapidly heading for 50, you wouldn't have had that aggressive imperial expansionist urge that Japan had back in the 1920s or even in the 1910s. I don't think you could imagine a British Empire being built by a country with the kind of demography that Britain has now, which, again, people may think that's a good thing, but we're trying here to understand the process of history rather than to judge them. So I think a young population gives a certain dynamism and aggression. I think a large population gives you a potential to raise a larger army. So the side with the larger force normally wins. But if the technological gap is enormous, then it can trump sheer population size. So if you look at Britain's hold over India, that was largely technological, even though Indians were very young and it was a very large population. So it's not as simple as the side with the largest population or the youngest population wins. But again, if you look at something like the American occupation or the British American occupation of Iraq or Afghanistan, it's not that the populations of Britain and America aren't bigger than those of Afghanistan or Iraq, or they weren't in 2000, although they're growing very rapidly. It's an aging population with not that many people wanting to go in the armed forces, with not that much aggression.
Every death counts more.
Yes, against a very young population with very large families. Again, both Afghanistan and Iraq are seeing falling fertility now, but it's a slow process, and it's much higher than the UK. And so when you've got this very young population, growing population, it's much harder to dominate it. In a way, Britain could march into Iraq. I can't remember what the population of Iraq would have been in 1917, 1918, 1919. But compared to Britain, Britain's has probably grown 50% since. Iraq's might have quadrupled or tripled, and it's very young. So it's not a simple equation. History isn't maths, but if you want to understand why Britain could dominate Iraq in 1919, but not in 2010, to do so without thinking about the dynamics of the population, the youthfulness of the population, the size of the population doesn't make much sense.
Guys, we might not be able to raise a birth rate straight away, but what we can do is produce more amazing episodes like this with Paul. If you like what you're watching, please like, subscribe, and follow. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get back to it.
And sticking on this, a bit that I found fascinating in The Human Tide is when you spoke about World War I. And I've heard a lot about the race to arms, the race for coal, the race for oil in World War II, the race for technology, but I never heard about the race for population growth and how France was scared of Germany, Germany was scared of Russia, Britain was scared of continental Europe. Can you give us more of an explanation of what was going on and how this kind of race for population was happening?
Well, the reason I think it's relatively new at that point is because in the past, before the Malthus era, but in the world that Malthus came to explain, populations weren't very dynamic. You got a plague and it didn't knock it back. You had a good series of harvests and it grew. There wasn't a real pattern to demography. By 1900, 1914, there was a pattern emerging. People didn't understand it, though. So the French had seen their population decline relative to Britain and Germany. Britain and Germany had seen their populations grow and then became, in the first decade of the 20th century, quite conscious of falling fertility rates. People didn't really understand fertility rates. They counted it as a birth rate, which just looks at how many births per population rather than how many children are women having. So 1900 to 1910 in Britain and Germany, women were only having about 3 kids on average. But of course, there was a huge cohort of young women having children because there had been a much higher fertility rate.
Can you explain the difference to us of
yes,
birth rates,
so
TFRs?
if you think of two islands, say with 1 million people each, one is full of old people. It's a few young people. And the other is full of young people, lots and lots of people in their 20s and 30s. Imagine they both have 1 million people and they have the same number of births. You'd say, well, they've got the same fertility. They've got the same birth rate, the same births over total population. But in the one with not many young people, those young people are producing a lot of children. And in the one with a very large number of young people, they're only producing the same number of people. So the average woman in that old society with not many people, not many young people, if they're producing the same number of children as the society with lots of young women, they're having more children. The reason we look at the births per woman, I think it should be births per couple, but obviously it's complicated because sort of men come and go and women have to bear the children. But I always think very strongly that we shouldn't make, therefore, because we count it per woman, it's all on the women. But anyway, the reason we look at births per woman is that tells you how fertile a country is, what people's choices are today. And it shows you what people are choosing who are in the young generation. And it doesn't carry the weight, whereas the birth rate just looks at the births per population. And it doesn't. So if Japan, for example, Japan's got so many old people and so relatively few young women, if they had the same birth rate as a much younger country, they would have a much more high fertility rate. And we'd say, oh, Japan's not got a very good birth rate, but they've started to tick up on the fertility rate. Their young generation today, small though it is starting to have more kids. And that's why we look at the fertility rate we're more interested in the fertility rate than the birth rate. The point, really, to come back to your original question, is that by the start of the 20th century, there were countries that had really made significant progress through their demographic transition, like Britain and Germany. France, a bit of an exceptional case, had a long-standing low fertility rate. Russia had high fertility, but their death rate was starting to come down. So they was just the beginnings of industrialisation, the beginnings of better food, and Russia in many ways was making great strides before the First World War. And so their population, people didn't understand the demographic transition. That really was only described in the late 1920s and fully in the 1940s. So people didn't understand it, but they were conscious that they were going to have to fight a war. There was an increasing sense of the inevitability of war, and a sense that the larger your army, the more chance you had. Now, if you were looking now at countries that had good technology, industry, you weren't looking at fighting the Zulus. You weren't looking at fighting the people with no industry and no organization and no technology. So if you were worrying about your neighbors who were at a similar level of technological development, and you could see every year how many young men were the Germans calling up to do their national service versus the British didn't have national service, they do the same sums. And it dawned on people that things were changing very quickly because of this demographic transition process. And therefore they were either gaining or losing power. And I think the Germans were particularly conscious of this enormous population growth in Russia, going to allow Russia to raise much larger armies.
Was this the first time that this was happening? I'm just thinking back into kind of pre-modern societies like the Spartans. Was there an idea that to be more prosperous, we need more children, and to fight like better armies, we need like more children, and therefore there was a push top down to increase fertility?
I think there's always been a sense, some writers in history, all the way back, as you say, to the classical period, that more people is a good thing in military terms and maybe in economic terms as well. What I don't think people had was the clarity of understanding about how many children they were having in their societies, how many the neighbouring countries were having. There wasn't the statistical framework. There wasn't the statistic. People were much hazier on what was actually going on. By the start of the 20th century, there were censuses, or there'd been censuses in Britain since 1800, censuses that were more scientific. Of course, the Ottomans did censuses famously, and who were they surveying? And it was very much around the number of fighting men.
You need to tax the non-Muslims. So
yeah,
you need to
exactly.
find out how many of them exist.
They counted the Muslims who they could put in arms and non-Muslims who would pay the jizya and so on. So it's not like it was new, but it was more scientific. It was more focused. It was in the press. There was popular views about it, which it wouldn't have been back in sort of 18th century Anatolia. So it's not a completely new phenomenon. I think what's new about it is, first of all, the changes are rapid because of the demographic transition. Secondly, people are much more aware of it than they would have been. And thirdly, the data is better, so people have got something more to say about it.
Would you go as to far to say that there's an innate thing in humans who believe population growth is a good thing? And the reason why I say this is if you look at some of the religions or cultures like Islam, Christianity, they're very pronatal and they've existed for thousands of years. And even if you look at sort of the more successful societies today, like Mormonism or some of the Jewish communities, again, very pronatal, and you can see from just the fertility rates that they will exist for a long time.
If you have, on average, a couple having 6 or 7 children, which is probably the historical average. I mean, there's much debate and it varied at times. But if you have a young couple who get married, and it was normally within marriage historically, in their late teens, and they have normal sexual relations, maybe there's a longer breastfeeding, which maybe slow things down. Some are taken out of the system through monasteries and nunneries. But let's say that they have, on average, you kind of get to 6 children per couple. If a third of those die before their first or second birthday, and 2/3 die before they get to 15 or 16, and that's at the high end of mortality. It was not uncommon. Then if you don't produce 6 or 7, you're going to die out as a society. So there's almost a Darwinian meme, or a sort of if your culture's not pronatal, if you're not pushing people to, on average, have 6 or 7 children, you will die out. And in a world where there were famines and there were plagues, and that was quite common, and lots of children died before they got to the age where they could have children themselves, there was a sense that of vulnerability, a sense that society might fold if you don't have children, and where you didn't have that pronatal culture, you probably didn't survive as a society. I think there's a much forgotten book by Leonard Woolf, the husband of Virginia Woolf, called The Village in the Jungle. He spent 10 years in Sri Lanka as a colonial administrator, roughly 1900 to 1910. And one of the great things, that book's remembered in Sri Lanka, but it's almost not read anywhere. And Leonard Woolf didn't make as big a splash as his wife. But one of the interesting things about that book is you do get the sense of the village having this pressure on it from outside. The jungle's always pressing onto the village. And if you have a bad harvest and a lot of kids die, and or people aren't having large families, there's this sense of constantly pushing against nature. And if you're not pushing against nature, nature will push against you. And in the end, if I remember correctly, the village is abandoned and it's overgrown. And there's this sort of there's a personal struggle for existence. There's also a collective and a communal and a national one. So if you, in a nutshell, yes, if you don't have a pronatal idea, then you probably won't have made it through to existing in the modern world.
So human history has been full of pronatalism. We spoke about pre-modern societies. We spoke about even like as close as World War I. And today that doesn't seem to be the case. Fertility rates, birth rates are declining pretty much everywhere, especially in the Western world. What are the main causes to this?
I talked about this demographic transition. When I learned it at school in the 70s, the idea was it would finish with people having about 2 kids per family, and that would mean the population would stabilize. And what's happened is, for a long time, a lot of countries like Britain, France, America have been below that replacement level, not dramatically below, but that's had an effect of aging the society, meaning more and more dependence and retirees to the number of people working. I think that has huge pressures on the welfare state and on government and so on. But what's happened recently is that a lot of countries like Britain and France, Germany and the US have seen the fertility rates fall even more. We've had countries in East Asia, Korea particularly, but if you look at Hong Kong or Macau, China, insofar as we can look at the data, the fertility rate's gone, not only continued to fall, but gone really super, super low. And then, as I said, in a lot of quite poor countries outside sub-Saharan Africa, fertility rates really nosedived, even though they're not that developed yet. So why is that happening? The drivers of low fertility, the 3 things that I always put my finger on, are people getting richer, people getting more educated, and people getting more urban. And that's the classic development through the transition that gets you from 6 to 2, say. So what's really happening now that we're going from 2 to 1, or 2 to 1.5, 2 to 1.5, and 1.5 towards 2? And that's the case in vast swathes of the world. Chile, for example, is quite not a particularly prosperous South American country. It's got a lot of copper. It's not super poor, but it's not that wealthy. They've got a nosediving fertility rate. Most of Latin America has. Puerto Rico has a lower fertility than any state in the US. So we're seeing this become much more general. So I think it goes beyond the material now. It's not just the old story of you getting richer, you getting urban, women are getting educated. They don't just want to have loads of kids. They can understand the idea of contraception and they can use it. I think that gets you down from 6 to 2. What's getting you down from 2 to 1 or 2/3? The disastrously low levels of fertility that we've got now. Now, I think you are probably better positioned to say than I am because it's your generation that are not having kids. Although I've got some insight. I've got some insight as a demographer, so I look at the survey data. I've got some insight as a father of 3 children. 2 of them have already got 2 children each. The third was married at 26, and he's still 26, and I hope and expect him to have a reasonable number of children in due course. No pressure there. But there seems to be something deeply cultural going on. And it has various aspects. One is a sense among young people that they don't want to have children, perhaps. They've got other projects, or they have environmental concerns. It's just not that high a priority. I think there's also a crisis. There seems to be a crisis of partnering going on. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. If you look at political attitudes between young men and women, they seem to be coming apart in a way that, if you went back to 1970, you'd have said the key difference is someone's class, what education they got, what they're earning. Tell me that, and I'll tell you whether they're left wing or right wing. Now, it seems that young women are becoming extremely progressive, and a lot of young men are not. So there's a divergence of political attitudes, which is only of interest to me as a demographer if that means that people find it difficult to couple up. And I think politics matters quite a lot. So, I mean, I've always had almost identical political views to my wife, and we've known each other since the 80s, and we've always felt that was just one of those things that makes life a bit easier, that you're not arguing about politics. But it goes much more deep than that. Why? There may be something to do with the whole online world, online dating, pornography. There seems to be a whole range of issues now that, for whatever reason, as I say, you probably understand it better than I do, militate against someone in their 20s coupling up, I would say marrying, but most births, now slight majority of births in the UK are outside marriage, have been for a long time in France. Other countries like Greece, for example, Italy, it's a much lower. But whatever the marriage is another question. People are not committing and having children in their 20s and early 30s in the way they were. And I think that's, obviously there's something about house prices. But if you look at house prices if you look at fertility in parts of Britain where house prices are cheap, or parts of Europe where property is not a constraint, they're still having a big drop-off in their fertility rate. But so it seems to be cultural rather than material, but I haven't got a really simple answer to it.
Just on the house prices one, so you're saying in places in the UK that are cheaper, they're still not having enough kids, but isn't it linked to prosperity too? So the most prosperous part of the UK is London, where it's like 9 times earning. So yeah, in Blackpool, there's plenty of cheap houses, but even the people there can't afford it because they don't have the incomes, they don't have the jobs. I just can't get, like, when I'm thinking about my reasons of not having kids, a lot of it comes down, again, material as opposed to cultural. Like, I come from 4 siblings. I do want to have like kids. Again, I don't want to have 6 kids. I would like to have 2 to 3. And the reason why I'm not having them now is I don't think I have the income or the wealth, or I have a big enough, house to go there. And again, some of my other friends who are a bit earlier, I think a relationship plays a massive role. And I think when looking at it, again, and I think you picked on the right thing, where women have more progressive values, and it comes down to something as simple as like chores. So I don't know, a lot of my female friends would say they would want a husband or a boyfriend who would come home and do the same chores as them, while a lot of my male friends have more traditional roles at that. And when it comes down to that mismatch of something as simple as who's going to wash the dishes after both of you are at work, the men that I know have a more traditional view than some of the women who are more progressive and are like, actually, these roles aren't defined by gender. It's defined by who's free and who wants to do it.
Well, let's start with your point about housing. Of course, in poorer parts of the UK where houses are cheaper, wages are lower. So the question then is not really objectively the house price. It's what your living standard is. And living standards today may not have grown fantastically, but they're better than when I was born or when I had my kids. They're certainly not worse. So it's about expectations. And I think people today have an expectation of perhaps owning a home. They wouldn't want to have children. I mean, when we had our first child, we were renting. People don't want to do that. We were in a fairly small 2-bedroom flat. A lot of people say, I want to. So it's about expectations. I'm not preaching at anyone, but I think material expectations have moved. People's desire for security and certainty before they. Whereas when we had our first child, it wasn't that unusual. You know, we were in quite a precarious situation. I was a postgraduate student. We didn't own a house, and you know, we just let's have a baby and we'll figure it out. And you know, I'm not saying that's what people should do. But I think there is a material element, but I don't think it's just that people are worse off than they were in the past, and maybe they have greater expectations of how much they're going to spend on phone or clothes or holidays. So that kind of, I think that covers the first point.
Just one more thing to add to that. So I think if we're talking about the 70s, and I'm going to use my parents as an example, there was a big cultural expectation to have kids irrespective of your income. So my dad, he had no job and still had like 2 to 3 kids because there was a cultural expectation. But when you have choice and you can compare the two, and you know you won't be stigmatized for not having children, then it makes sense to like not have them. While 50 years ago or 40 years ago, that choice didn't exist. It was as simple as like having driving lessons or going to school, that you are just going to be
Doesn't that reinforce Paul's point, though, that this is primarily cultural?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are loads of pressures working against people having children. And in the past, there was this pressure unseen to some extent. That's what you're expected to do. That's what you will do. That is the norm. And we didn't really question it. We just went along with it. When that goes, then I think you need a countervailing narrative, which I'm trying to sort of, even if I can't produce it, I'm trying to say we need it. What's the countervailing narrative that says it's no longer your mussy telling you what you must do or whatever, and you know, tut, 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 you've been married for so long and whatever. I won't do my South Asian accent, probably offend you. But, you know, I know plenty of such cases, and they exist in all cultures. When that goes, what's going to replace it? And if nothing replaces it, we'll end up with very low fertility rates. I think something's got to replace it. I wanted to come back to your point about roles, sort of gender roles. I think that that's a man issue, that if we are going to say women are the equals to men, which I believe they are intellectually, they can do the same jobs as men in an increasingly white-collar world. We need them in the workplace. Therefore, we have to get rid of these ideas that I worked very hard and my wife worked very hard, and there was no sense that because she was the woman, she would do the cooking and change the nappies. If I was around, I'd do it. You know, sometimes I was working harder, sometimes she was working harder. But I think if men are not prepared to say women are equal and women are needed in the workplace, but we're not going to step up in the home, then that is part of the problem. So I do think there is a man question that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Paul, this is super interesting because if you look especially today amongst young people, Gen Z, a lot of people say they don't want to have kids because of, let's say, climate change, because of sort of existential fears. But if anything, it seems that in history, when you have an existential pressure and force on you, that actually makes you have more kids and larger families. So what do you think's happened in the modern world where these things are inverted?
I think the environmental opposition to having children has 2 aspects, and they're both worth talking about. One is, I couldn't bring a child into this terrible world. And the other is, if I bring a child into this world, he or she will emit and add to the problem. And I think they're actually slightly separate. And I think there's a good argument that needs to be had against both. So I think it's problematic. And I think the best way to tackle it is to argue against it. So in terms of this is the worst world ever, how can I bring a child into it? I mean, think when I was born, I'm not that old, something like 2 to 3% of kids would die in their first year in Britain, which was really low. When my parents, my paternal grandfather was born in the 1880s. So imagine how high infant mortality was then. He was born in Germany, it's maybe a fifth or something like that. So his parents brought him into the world in a very uncertain, a very precarious world. There was much less food, there was much less prosperity, housing was much worse. There was much more likelihood he was going to have to go off to war. In fact, he spent 4 years in the trenches in the First World War. So we actually are bringing children into a much better world now. The food is cleaner, the water's cleaner, the air is cleaner, their life expectancy is longer, their chance of dying very young. So I think the whole argument of this is too bad, of course we can't know. We might all get wiped out by a meteor or a nuke tomorrow. But basically, my perspective or my kids' perspective of having children now, if they look at objectively at the prospects for their children, they're much better than my prospects were when I was born, and my prospects were much better than when my parents or grandparents were born. So I think we should say if now is not good enough to have children, our parents and grandparents were criminal to have children, and the whole of humanity in the past has had children in much more precarious situations. So the first aspect is the world's so awful we can't have kids. I think that's unhistorical. The second aspect is if I have a child, he or she will emit, and that will be terrible. There are many arguments against that. One is if you look at a country like the UK, emissions are falling per capita. By the time a child today has his or her own home and car, they'll probably be emitting almost nothing. Young people with inventiveness and creativity will solve these problems in a way aging societies won't. And we know as societies age, there are fewer and fewer patents, fewer and fewer new ideas. So all the technology we need to cope with the environmental problems will cease. And the other thing I've frequently said is that if you are living in a Western country or a developed country and you're expecting someone to drive the bus, someone to be at the doctor's surgery, someone to care for your elderly parent, you're actually consuming labour. You won't produce it. You're bringing people in from very low emissions countries to high emissions countries. Now, immigration is a whole different topic. You can be pro, you can be anti. But if you're pulling people in from very low emissions countries to high emissions countries, you're not saving the planet by saying, instead of having children, I'll move someone from Syria to Germany or the DRC to Britain or El Salvador to the US, and their emissions will grow 40, 50, 60 times. So that's, I think, how I would deal with the environmental question.
Paul, just on the whole cultural issue that we're talking about here. So looking at my own personal experience, the people in my network that I know that have kids in their 20s, one guy that I went to school with, he's got 3 kids already. He's not even 30, which is quite rare in this day and age. It seems like so far it's like the ultra religious people and the ultra traditional people, they're the ones that kind of, no matter what, they're willing to slum it out. They're willing to live in zone 6. They're willing to live in like a really tough, 1-bed apartment with 2 kids or something like that. Whereas people like me and Akhil, who maybe are less religious and not so much inclined that way, it's like we start thinking more about the material concerns. We start thinking about those things. So you said you're trying to reverse this. You said you're trying to create something new. But can you have like a secular pronatalist movement, or is it sort of intrinsically tied with sort of a metaphysical and kind of religious movement as well?
Well, I don't think we're going to solve it by getting everybody to be religious. So I'm not going to be a preacher. When I did my PhD rather late in life, I had a supervisor called Eric Kaufman, who wrote a very good book called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And he was looking at these different religious groups. And Eric has often said that we meet up very often and we often discuss these things. And he's said to me, can we create a pronatal? He's not particularly pronatalist, by the way. I mean, he sees these issues not particularly what he's interested in, what I'm interested in. But he says, can we create a pronatal culture without a religious revival? Is it only going to be the religious who have these large families? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think if we are going to survive as a society, we need to have more kids. And if we're going to have more kids, we need to find some way of doing it. And I think certainly in Britain and in most of the developed world, I do not see a great religious revival happening. I think on the contrary, there's a movement away from religion. So I think we have to find other narratives. Not that I'm anti-religious, but I'm far from it. But I think if I were to get on my soapbox and say we've all got to go back to religious fundamentals, otherwise we're lost, that's a counsel of despair. So then the question is, and it's over to you and to your generation, what could be the countervailing culture that says, yes, I'm in a precarious position, but I do have somewhere to live, I have got food on the table, and I will just get on with it. What makes it cool, if you like, to, as soon as I call anything cool, it's going to cease to be cool. But what makes you look at a 26-year-old with 3 kids or 28-year-old with kids and say, wow, that's a great way to lead your life. And I don't know the answer. It's not going to come from me or my generation. But I think unless we come up with something, I think there's lots of government policies and lots the government can do, and we can have education that is more less focused on avoiding sexually transmitted diseases and pregnancy, and more on the positivity of having a family and understanding the fall off in your fertility. So I think there's lots and lots we could do. We could reshape the welfare state, reshape the tax system. But I think ultimately, unless there's a cultural change, and maybe not your generation, but the one coming after you, says, yeah, this is what you really want to do, this chasing after the Instagram picture or whatever it is actually, and if it is the Instagram picture, it's the Instagram picture of me with my kid, not me with my kitten. I mean, that's what would shift it. I don't know where it's coming from, and that's my limitation as a demographer. And that's the limitation of someone of my age who's now got 4 grandchildren. So I'm not the cutting edge anymore.
Could you say that the cultural kind of comes after the material? And for example, the way you described your friend there, you said he had to slum it out. That to me doesn't seem attractive. Like the way you're describing having children, he has to slum it out to have those children and like live a life through like, difficulty. So is there a way that you can use government tax policy, welfare, have more pronatal policies at work so people don't get sort of punished for having children and taking time out, that will then ferment a positive culture where people look at people with kids and don't see them through despair and through hardship and actually see them, oh, I can see how that is an attractive proposition compared to what I'm currently in?
I don't know if the culture is upstream of the material or vice versa, but they're very closely related. In fact, I'm working on a book at the moment where I'm working with an economist called Philip Pilkington. We're writing a book about economics and demography and arguing that the current demography that we have in Britain and elsewhere in the developed world is guaranteeing us a very sluggish economy. But to get back to your question, what can we do materially? I think there is a lot we can do. And the sorts of things we could do, I've suggested in the past, is which exists in lots of countries, is having a differential tax system that gives tax breaks to people with children, which may mean higher taxes for those without. Maybe forgiving student debt, maybe teaching people, as I said, about their loss of fertility in the course of their 30s and 40s at school, getting rid of the 2-child cap, etc., etc. There's a whole range of material things you can do and we should do. I'm just not sure that alone is going to shift the culture or shift the fertility rate more than a few points. Worth doing, really important that government signals that we need to go down this path. But I think unless that gives rise to a cultural shift, or the cultural shift happens of its own accord, or we find some other ways of shifting the culture, then the impact on fertility rates will be very modest.
So if we're looking at across the world in general, sort of as material prosperity increases, as education increases, TFR goes total fertility rate goes well below replacement. But Central Asia is like an interesting example where it completely bucks the trend. It doesn't maybe have the same existential threat as like Israel, where, they've got a culture of like they've gone through so much and they need to actually reproduce. What do you think is going on in sort of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, those countries that allows them to have such healthy demographics?
Well, it's very interesting you ask, because I have been both to Israel and to Uzbekistan in the last 12 months. And you go to these places, and I haven't been as a demographer. I mean, I didn't go specifically with my demographic hat on, but of course, I've always got my demographic hat on in a sense. I mean, in Central Asia, there seems to be, and what's interesting in Central Asia is the fertility rate's gone up, having never been that low. But, for relatively undeveloped countries, it was starting to come down, and then it hasn't gone the way of Jamaica or Thailand, but it's sort of headed up. It seems that the best we can say, as far as I know, is that there is a very strong signalling from the government that this is what they want. There are prizes for mothers. I mean, Mongolia, not strictly in Central Asia, but you can bracket it with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. There's very strong signalling from the government. And it seems to be playing into a pronatal culture. That people want. Now, why they should be pronatal there but not in the Balkans, or why Mongolia but not Thailand, it's very, very difficult to say, because, I mean, there's an Islamic element, but at the same time, there is something of an Islamic revival. Uzbekistan's very strict on fundamentalism, and there are plenty of other Muslim countries where the fertility rate is slumping, like Iran, like Turkey. So the best you can say for Uzbekistan, I think certain things happen in society, and we do our best to understand them, and we don't always have full explanations. But the best thing I can say about Central Asia is they do seem to be, for whatever reason, inherently pronatal cultures. So when the government sends signals, when the government encourages people to have children and gives medals and highlights the role of the family and so on, it seems to resonate with the population.
But why does that not translate equally across all the ethnic groups in Central Asia? Because if we look at Kazakhstan, they've got a really healthy fertility rate. But compare ethnic Kazakhs to ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, one group is well above replacement level, the other is well below. And they're broadly speaking, they're in the same country, they have the same material conditions, they have the same incentives. So what's going on? Again, is it more grassroots cultural as opposed to top-down governmental incentives?
I think there's no doubt that the culture is very important and that for whatever reason, the culture of Russians and Ukrainians is a culture that has produced a very long period of low fertility. And if you look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it's not surprising that Russians and Ukrainians in Central Asia, well, by which I don't mean the war, I mean the very low fertility. If you take a Russian or Ukrainian in Central Asia, they live a very different life. There's a very clear distinction. I mean, I couldn't comment on how integrated people are, but there's a very clear sense of them as a different ethnic group. They probably think of themselves as superior. And there was very much a tradition in the Soviet Union, despite all its sort of Marxist terminology, first of all, looking down on Central Asians who were less developed and further back in terms of the demographic transition. And there's also a strong culture in Russia. Again, I haven't got data on this, but anecdotally, people I've talked to, that back certainly in the 60s and 70s and probably still today, people with large families were peasants. It was a peasanty, backward thing to have large families. And it would seem that when people came to the cities in Russia, Babushka had 7 kids back in the village, and those people, those awful people who've just arrived from the village down the hall have got their brats all over the place. And that's a backward thing. I think, they'd say it was a backward thing. And Russians and Ukrainians in Central Asia probably think of the populations among whom they live as backwards. And what's the key to survival as an ethnicity or as a society or as a nation is to advance. As, Ukraine's not poor. Uzbekistan's not a particularly poor country. They're not third world, as we would have said in the 60s or 70s. They're relatively poor, but they're not. They're making material progress to make material progress, and yet to keep a culture that means you have 2, 3, 4 children. That's the secret. And for whatever reason, the Russians and Ukrainians don't have that culture. And it seems in Central Asia that they seem to have been able to develop it.
Paul, my next question is the replacement rate. So the replacement rate today is 2.1. And I think that's pretty contextual because you said in the 1500s it was 6, 7.
Yeah.
So could it be, what is that replacement rate based on? It's based off human capital, right? As in it takes 2.1 to replace a couple that have that child. But if humans increase in efficiency, productivity, creativity, AI, all this kind of stuff, could it be that a couple only need 1 child to replace when they die, the outgoing?
Well, the 2.1 is purely demographic. It's not saying whether the economy will grow or not grow. It's simply saying how many children do people need to have for a population to be stable in the long term. Various factors influence the rise or fall of the population, the growth of life expectancy, the spacing of births. But broadly, if 2 people make 2 people, and those 2 people make 2 people, then the population will stabilize. The point 1 is because not everybody will make it through to, but we're now at a point in so much of the world and more of the world where death before the age of 40, say, or 45 is extremely unlikely. And so you really 2, if you think about it, 2 will do in terms of keeping the population stable. And of course, if people are living a bit longer, that will mean the population grows a bit. If people are spacing their births out, having them a bit later, that will depress it a little bit. But ultimately, people having 2 kids, replacing themselves in a world where those 2 kids will survive and be in the breeding pool potentially between, say, the ages of 18 and 40. That will stabilize your population. Now, another question is, what is needed for a dynamic economy? And some people would say it doesn't matter if the population declines because we've got all this new technology coming along. And I've written a chapter in No One Left in which I argue that we're there again. Everyone said this in the past. The machine smashers, the Luddites of the early 19th century said, if you've got machines doing the job, you won't need people, we won't have jobs, we won't have wages. And yet the Industrial Revolution happened. That was created a huge demand for labour. Then people said, well, we're now going to have robots in the factories. And if we've got, we don't need workers on the land because we produce all this food with a tiny share of the workforce. And if we're going to have the robots in the factory, we're always coming up with new ideas for jobs. We're always coming up with new needs for people. And I'm very skeptical that this time really will be different. And you're in the workplace, you're seeing what's happening. And I know, for example, in the legal profession, they're saying we don't need so many interns, and that's going to cause a problem because the AI can do the basic jobs, it can't do the more advanced jobs, and there won't be more advanced lawyers. That will sort itself out. There's so much of the economy, I think, particularly in an aging society, that is very hands-on, that's very care-oriented. You look around the building sites, again, a story I've told before, I looked at people putting a new roof on my house and thinking, well, they turned up in a truck, they could have done that 70 years ago. Everything they did, maybe the tiles upstream are manufactured more efficiently, but so much of what we see in our day-to-day lives is not getting more productive from a labour perspective. Things happen like you go for a sandwich or something and you press some buttons rather than ask someone. So there is always efficiency and productivity coming into the workforce. I just don't believe that if we have each cohort half the size of the last one, or a third of the size of the last one, that won't create a huge vortex in the economy. And we still need people, so we need so many hands doing so many jobs. I'm very skeptical. Now, it could be that I'm wrong, and it could be that in 30, 40 years' time, we have an elderly, shrinking population, but it's nicely looked after by robots. Well, at least we won't have gone down that particular sinkhole of lots of old people sitting on their own and the economy shrinking. But I think the lack of dynamism, the lack of energy in that society, and frankly, I don't just think people should have children because it's good for the economy. It's easy to quantify that. I think it's personally very sad if you don't produce the next generation, because it suggests you have no vision for the future, you have no sense of yourself as part of a continuity. And in the end, I think at the end of your days, you'll probably look back on your life and feel, what was that worth? I remember someone who worked for my parents, a very, very nice woman. I was very fond of her. And I remember when her husband died, and they had no children, she turned to us and said, is that it? And there is that sense. So that's more subjective, it's personal.
No, I agree. There's something in us as humans that want to procreate. Otherwise, we wouldn't have lasted as long as we do.
Yeah.
I find it, I think you find it, like when I look at my nephew, I don't know, it kind of like builds it as well. I think there is something innate that makes you want to procreate. And I think all humans share that. Well, the majority.
Yeah.
But I think
they have done today. Whether maybe your generation will be the first one that doesn't.
But I want to give the perspective from like one of my existential friends. If I showed her this podcast, this is what she'll say to me. She'll say to me, there's 1.6, I think one out of 6 children are in poverty in the world. How can you have a pronatal culture, or how can you even tell people to have children if you can't guarantee some basic welfare for them? And it's kind of like you're pushing more and more children. But if we're going to have 100 more children, but those 100 million more children are going to be in the mines in Uganda, or they're going to be chimney sweepers, then do we even want those children to exist?
Well, I think that gets back to the point I was making earlier. We've never had a time in history where more children are coming into the world who will be well fed, who will live longer lives, who won't die early, who'll have educational opportunities. I mean, if you look at the share of people who are literate, or if you look at the share of people who go to university, or if you look at the share of people who are going to live to their 60s or 70s or 80s, if today's world is not good enough to bring, of course there'll always be tragedies and there'll always be sadnesses. But if you're going to wait for the perfect world where there are no environmental challenges, there's never an economic slump, nobody will die, nobody will be in pain, we'll cease to exist. And we would never have got to this point as a human race if people had taken that point of view. And the strange thing is, as it gets better and better, as we live longer, as we live more healthily, as we eat better, as our prospects, I'm not just talking about Britain, I mean much more than Britain, the world's become much less unequal. Kids in China, kids in much of Africa, kids in Latin America, they're getting better educations, they're getting better looked after, they're getting better housing, they're getting better clothing than they would have had in every respect. as things get better and better, we seem to be saying, oh, it's too dreadful a world, and until we reach perfection, we're not going to have any kids. And that really is just the end of the human race.
I think it's less perfection. I think it's more when you see the stat, 1 in 6 children are in poverty.
Yeah, but what would it have been 30, 40 years ago? Particularly if you take an absolute measure of poverty, it might have been 1 in 2.
But could you imagine the same way literacy rates are in a lot of societies 100%, the poverty rate could also be 0%, and that could then it would be much easier to push a pronatal perspective, because you could be like, your child's got a kind of 100% chance of living a better life than before. When I look around, I don't think I can guarantee, if I have a child, a better life than mine. When you look at house prices, when you look at environmental catastrophes, climate change, and again, we're speaking to that person who's existential. Again, we're not speaking to me, but we're speaking to somebody who is existential, who's really concerned about the future and guaranteeing their children a better life than them. And then when you add on top of that the demographic change we're having, where I currently support, I don't know, 2 non-taxpayers, but they will probably, support 4 taxpayers, non-taxpayers. What future are we, even if you do decide to have a kid and you're pronatal, you're in an antenatal world, so your child's just going to have this massive burden, and how are they going to navigate that?
Well, I think there are no guarantees in life. If you're waiting for a guarantee, don't get out of bed, don't go to university, don't get a job. It might be horrible. Your boss might be nasty to you. There might be a bomb on the train. You might get run over by a bus. I mean, let's just go and die in our beds if we're looking for guarantees. If we're looking for probabilities, the probabilities are getting better. And I think not to have children because no one else is going to have them, and therefore they're going to have a lot of tax burden to bear, seems to be a doom loop. And the other point on that, of course, is as society ages, if you really want a selfish reason to have children, more and more older people are going to rely on their kids to get them through the system. They may need financial help from their children. They may, my mother's 91, and I take her to, or my sister or one of the grandkids takes her to a hospital appointment, helps her. She's very good, but, actually navigating even today's support levels without any younger help. So the fewer and fewer kids there are, the more and more, and the more abandoned and neglected the older generation is going to be, the more you should have children. You don't want to be childless in that kind of world.
On this topic of the doom loop, if we look at like councils across Britain, we're seeing a lot of them are going bankrupt, not because of, let's say, roads or infrastructure, because of adult social care. And in an aging society, that's only getting worse and worse and worse. And if we're stuck in this doom loop where the population continues to decrease, demographics continues to get worse, is the welfare state in its current form still sustainable? Are we going to see maybe 30 years down the line, we might not have pensions, or maybe 40, 50 for us, but yeah, we might not have pensions, we might not have social care, we might be completely abandoned by the end of it. Is that what you see happening? Or
I think the welfare state as it exists at the moment will not continue to exist. It was built in a world where, traditionally Bismarck was the Bismarckian state. I think it was 70, the age of retirement. There were so few people who lived beyond 70 and so many young workers. It still could work in Britain in the 1940s. It's not going to work in Britain in the 2040s. It's going to be, or any other developed country. And you see the rising debt levels of the government, the withering of tax revenues, and the ever-growing demands on the health service, because just to stand still, we need to spend more and more as we have a burgeoning number of older people who take 6 or 7 times as much spend. So the whole contract will collapse. And I don't know exactly how it will collapse. I don't know whether we'll end up with a bond market saying we're not going to fund this anymore and we'll have to go to the IMF, and the IMF will make the government do the cuts, or we'll end up with a government that does it itself. I don't know. It's a similar challenge throughout the developed world, but it just isn't going to work. And already you can see it coming, fraying at the edges. And so I think one of the things we should do, I was on Amal Rajan's podcast on the BBC a couple of weeks ago, and I said, why have I got a pass to travel around London as a 60-year-old when young people struggling with their first jobs paying a huge amount of tax? And what is this nonsense with the triple lock? We should be looking after people who need the help. We should be incentivizing people to work hard and benefit from the sweat of their brow, if you like. We should not be spending huge amounts of money on unmeans-tested benefits for the older generation.
Yeah, no, definitely. So do you see politics sort of starting to frame more along those lines, where maybe you have the childless versus people with children, and they're sort of at heads because on one hand, they're going to want sort of governmental support, societal support. On the other hand, they'll be like, wait, why are my kids paying for you when you didn't decide to have kids in the first place? Can you see like more radicalism and more sort of division within politics in the future?
think there is a generational divide. I think there is a growing sense on part of your generation that the large baby boomer generation is sitting there not working, taking more and more of the GDP. And I don't know how that will play out. I don't know which political party is going to start to say we're going to change that, because one of the problems is that my generation is a large generation and it votes, and the younger people don't vote. So that then worries me about, well, if the young people aren't voting, the system's not working for them, what's going to happen? What somehow the system won't survive. But again, I can't say how. As a demographer, I don't claim. I think you can't think about the future or understand the past without understanding the demographic lens. But I'm not a determinist. I'm not saying because this is happening, therefore this is what will happen in the political future. But I can say I don't see how the current system is sustainable, and something's going to give at some point in some way.
Paul, how much can we look at Korea and Japan as examples of what our future is going to look like? We do have one benefit. We're multicultural society, so we can import a lot of immigrants to help with the fertility rate, and you kind of show that in the book. But how is what Japan and South Korea facing now going to be our future?
Well, I think I also say in the book, first of all, we've been fortunate that we've been able to change, to shore our demography up. But this is not, the endless mass immigration is not sustainable politically, and it's not sustainable in lots of other ways. But that has been a stopgap for us in a way. Japan has chosen not to, or Korea, and actually they don't want it. But also, I think it is very hard for people to assimilate into Japanese and Korean cultures. I vaguely know someone whose family is Korean, have been in Japan for generations, and they're still viewed as sort of very foreign by the Japanese. So what we see with Japan is growing and growing government debts. Like here in Britain, we've got 100% of GDP. Debt to GDP. In Japan, it's like 250%. So someday the Japanese will just stop, the whole thing will stop being funded. We see a huge drop-off in Japan's patents, new ideas. It's not the creative country it was. We see a real dramatic decline in its GDP growth. Japan was like the second economy of the world, and now it's just slipping and slipping and slipping. I haven't been to Japan, I've been to Korea, but everyone tells me it's still a great country and it functions. But a previous prime minister said there will be societal collapse, and there will be. And if you go out to the villages, they must be abandoned. The whole sense of the society just consolidating into a single city. And Korea is behind Japan in the sense they got low fertility later, but it's moving faster. So they're only having perhaps 3/4 to 2/3 of a child per couple. So I think they are the laboratories of the future. In many ways, they're successful and cohesive countries, but they are heading for problems. I can't see how they will be thriving and succeeding. And already we can see they're becoming more sclerotic. And roll it forward. Japan's already at a point where it's got 2 workers per retiree. Roll that forward to 1-to-1 towards the end of the century. Don't see how they're going to function. And sometime between now and then, the wheels are going to come off.
You don't see AI or technology kind of...
Well, no, I mean, I as I say, I don't think that will substitute for all the hands-on jobs needed, particularly in an aging society.
Paul, this does worry me a bit, because it seems like if sensible people don't come together with solutions, then we could see just more political radicalism. Like in Korea, you've got the 4B movement, don't you, amongst the women? And then you also had I think the most recent prime minister tried to have a military coup in a democracy like Korea, which is like very much unheard of. So are we going to slide towards just more crazy politics?
Well,
like
it was the president, but
yeah.
Yes, I can see the problems. I can see where the pressures are going to come, but I don't think from the perspective of demography, I'm able to foretell a party will emerge for young women, or the young will go onto the street. I don't think that's the way history works. I think you can look back, and understanding the demographic pressures can inform you to understand what happened. And you can see so I can see what the politics of the 2030s, 2040s might look like in this country, and what sort of issues there are going to be intergenerationally with the government debt, with a shrinking workforce, with the pressure on the one hand, people don't want more mass immigration. On the other hand, there'll be a shortage of workers. So I can see all these pressures playing out. But does that mean that it's going to be Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage or someone else? I just
Yeah.
don't think that I can. I'm not a prophet.
You don't have a crystal ball.
No.
So, yeah.
Paul, so the whole world is in low fertility. In Africa, fertility remains high. So what does the future of Africa look like if it's the only continent, and I think it's sub-Saharan Africa mainly, that has high fertility rates?
Well, it is coming down in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but what you get is this: you get the fertility rate coming down, but still a high birth rate to get back to. So you've got women starting to have fewer children in countries like Kenya, and other East African countries more, and South Africa it's already like 3. But because of historic growth, you've still got this big cohort of young women, even if they're not having that many children. So they're still so they're still having. So there's a huge amount of growth in Africa. And I think this is the great challenge for humanity. So as Africa grows as a share of the world population towards a third, having been, I can't remember, like 7% in 1950, think of all the things that Africa will need: the schools, the universities, the roads. Huge amount of capital investment's going to be needed. And will Africa be able to generate that for itself? This is the great challenge of humanity as other continents fade and more of the future of humanity is in sub-Saharan Africa. Will they be able to sort their problems out? Will they have the kinds of economies, political setups that allow them to thrive? And I think that will determine whether humanity succeeds in the latter half of this century and the first 20, 30 years of the next one or not. And the answer, there'll be no single answer. Some countries will, I can see some countries already making more of a success of it than others. I don't think it will be a simple succeed or fail. But increasingly, as more and more, and this is exactly why demography matters, as more and more of humanity resides in sub-Saharan Africa, the future of humanity is going to be the future of sub-Saharan Africa.
And sticking on that, we spoke earlier how demography links to world powers. So you see falling birth rates in China, India as well. There's reports that they're also having falling birth rates in America too. So could you see a superpower emerge out of Africa, and could Africa be the kind of as the West is today, like highly technological, highly innovative, with like a massive economy?
It could be, and if it's going to have a third of the world's population, it will need to be. It's hard to imagine Africa going from 7% of the world's population to 35% and not punching more above its weight, or more significantly in terms of the economy, in terms of global culture, in terms of power. But again, I can't say exactly how it will be, but I can say that the world of 2100, where a third of people will be African or more, is going to be very different from the world of 1950, where it was 7%. It's going to be much more important culturally, militarily, in terms of power. But how that will play out and which countries will succeed, and maybe a lot of that will end up being rather like Europe was in 1914 with Africa turning on itself, or maybe it will be more successful. I don't know, but it will matter a lot more than it did. It already does.
And I know you're not a prophet, but do you see anything changing? Do you have any murmurs of like the government pushing a pronatal policy, or are we just going to sleepwalk into this?
Well, in terms of Britain, we've been a bit behind the curve. So the French have always talked about it, and Macron was talking about a demographic rearmament, I think. And France has been quite successful. It's had pronatal policies, and it's been one of the better performers in the developed world. But British politicians never spoke. I mean, the British politicians who've spoken about it, I know them. Like there are 2 of them. Neil O'Brien, who was the Tory spokesman for education. I can't remember. He's a Tory frontbencher. Miriam Cates, who was a Tory backbencher and lost her seat, does a lot of work for GB News. That was it. In the world of pronatalism 2-3 years ago. Now, 2 things have changed. We've had Keir Starmer talk about it. And what did he say? Nothing to do with me, not interested. I'm not going to tell people how many children to have. And then Bridget Phillipson, the Secretary of State for Education, actually said we should be helping people to have more children if that's what they want. So people are just about starting to talk about it. One of my friends who's quite active in the reform said, "Oh, did you notice Nigel Farage wants to lift the 2-child cap? I think you've had an influence on him." Well, I've been on his show a couple of times. I can't say that's all down to me. But I think people are starting to listen. People are starting to realise it's not a left-right thing. I think when I wrote my article in the Sunday Times 3 years ago saying we should have a differential tax.
Yeah, you got a lot of stick for that.
I got a lot of stick, which is great. I mean, I was all over the place. I wasn't cancelled, on the contrary. Yeah. I even went on Radio 2, having been on Radio 4 quite a lot. And, there was very much a pushback. This is far-right stuff. I'm really appreciative of people like Aaron Bastani on Novara Media, people like the New Statesman, who are seen as on the left, somewhat actually saying, hold on a minute. If we want a socialist society or a more equal society or a thriving society of left or right, whatever it is not going to be there if we don't have the next generation. So I'm pleased to say it feels like it's becoming less party political. Not that the Tories were ever in favour, or not so much party, but it's. I'm not being categorised as a right-wing extremist just because I say this is a real issue. I think people have got over that.
It's a bipartisan issue at the end of the day, or it has to be for our future. The way I see it at the moment, in terms of like, we're on the Titanic, the iceberg is there and we can't course correct. So even if we make those cultural changes, it will take decades before we actually see any meaningful results from that. Now I'm starting to see from Silicon Valley and from the Americans some crazy technologies that they're looking at, anti-aging technology to sort of extend the fertility window well into the 40s. Even I've seen artificial womb startups as well. Do you think these new technologies have any role to play in terms of actually bringing more births and more kids?
I hope we don't need them.
Yeah,
I mean, for goodness sake, what is it about us that we can't say the average couple has 2 to 3 children? Yeah. I'm not saying we need to have 6 or 10 or whatever, or that we will have to start breeding in our early 20s. What is it about us that we say, we've got to a point where unless we have, racks of embryos, I'm not an expert on this technology. I think technology will continue to extend our life expectancy, and probably we will be able to work longer, although we don't necessarily want to. And certainly extending the date of retirement is going to be an important part of this equation, and you can only do that if people are up to working longer and they expect to live longer. So, technology will play its role. Are we going to end up in a world where the state says, well, people don't want kids, so we are going to produce the children for the state, we'll bring them up? I mean, it's quite scary in many ways.
Sounds like the Matrix.
Brave New World.
Yeah, and I don't like the idea of over-relying on technology. It reminds me of a Catholic friend of mine who has got 3 kids, but her siblings have got like crazy numbers, 11 and 13. And I explained to her, there's a great couple in the States who talk about this a lot, and who say, we should have all this technology, and actually we need to create a religion, because the religion, as you say, the religion.
I think I'm familiar. I saw a podcast with Chris Williamson where they were on.
Yes, yeah. And we need all this technology, and we need a religion, and the religion is that we're going to be better and better technologically, so our future will be, our descendants will be greater and greater and greater. They'll be like God, so we must worship our descendants, and therefore, that becomes, so it's very interesting and innovative. And I explained this to a Catholic friend of mine, and she said, we seem very keen to reinvent what God has given us.
Yeah. And Paul, I think you touched on something like great there, which is a culture of optimism. And I think that's what we're lacking as a generation. Me personally, I ascribe to just thinking life is going to get better in my lifetime and just humanity. I don't know. I just don't want to be living day to day thinking that one day it's going to end. I just hope that we colonize other planets, we keep going. And I think you can have an ideology that's non-religious, that's based upon optimism and the world becoming a better place. And I think those stats that you mentioned before about how we're eradicating poverty, we're increasing literacy rates, helps in that. And I think if we are going to develop a culture, it's going to be a non-religious one, but one where we feel more agency in our lives to make it better, and we have a role for children in that the way the world is going to be a better place is if it's more innovative, if it's more efficient. And the way we're going to do that is not just by inventing new technologies, but also inventing new people to manifest our destiny.
The name of that couple, by the way, is the Collinses. That's
Simone and Malcolm. I've
Simone
seen
and
them.
Malcolm, I've met them, and they're great. And I think we need a pronatal movement of all types, and people like them and people like traditionalists as well. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't want to be a prophet of doom. I want to be a prophet of hope. I think we can do this. For goodness sake, if even I managed to have 3 kids, it can't be that big a deal. 2 to 3 children as the norm. Some won't have any, some will have more. Creating the sort of society where we've got that optimism and that hope that bring those children into the world is a good thing to do, and it creates meaning in your life and purpose. And it's the most important thing you can do and the most exciting thing you can do. And every time a new child comes into the world, it's a new personality. It's amazing as I see my grandchildren emerging and their personalities start emerging. So we do need a more positive outlook. We can't rely on religion because I don't think everybody's going to go religious. It is worrying if only ultra-religious people are having kids, society changes in ways you don't necessarily want it to change. So yes, I would like to give an upbeat message, and I specifically don't want to be a prophet of doom because I think we should be able to crack this.
Thank you so much for joining us, Paul, and we've really enjoyed this discussion. And hopefully there's been some great takeaways that people can take from this.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.